All right, Rabotai, I first want to give a very big Chazak Ubaruch to Avishai Shraga, who really presented to us, with a lot of hard work, the details of the Chachamim that there were throughout the generations in Iran, and there are many more. I want to thank Rabbi Levi Chaim for not only helping this shiur come about, but also for his wonderful introduction and his words that he said, which he encapsulated a lot of the points that I want to expand on. So I'm just going to expand on what Rabbi Levi Chaim said. Levi Chaim mentioned that there's a very big importance in a community following their minhagim for many different reasons. Not only because halachically there is an obligation for a community to follow their minhag, it's just an obligation. Recently, Rav David Yosef visited Los Angeles, and he confirmed what Rabbi Zargari said, is that his father was very passionate and adamant that people should follow their minhagim. There were certain piskei halacha that he forcefully wanted to change, but he agreed that somebody who has a minhag and wants to follow that minhag, in most cases, it's very important to keep the minhag. And the reason is the following: because minhagim are a connection that a person has to Har Sinai, we'll call it. When I talk about minhagim, I'm not talking about how your mother makes gondi or whatever else. I'm talking about halachot, how we're posek in the Shulchan Aruch. There's two opinions, and throughout the generations, I'm going to give examples that there were certain practices that were given from parent to children, and it's a disconnect. If a parent's going to do one thing, a child's going to do another thing. Imagine his child's going to go to another yeshiva, and they're going to teach him to follow another Sephardic Rav's psak, and so you have the father doing one thing, son doing another, grandson doing another. Where's the connection to Har Sinai? It's obviously it doesn't manifest itself in areas of hashkafa, in areas of emunah, but once you start playing around with the masoret, with the tradition, so who says it won't lead to that? So that's a point that I want to expand on. So that's what this shiur that is going to be about. I just want to speak a little bit before that how this book came about. I don't know if you know by now, I didn't grow up Persian. I don't know any Persian Jews until I came to Los Angeles. I had a few students. Nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. I had a few Persian students from Great Neck when I was teaching in yeshiva in Yerushalayim. 2005, I joined the Link Kollel in Westwood. It was in Westwood at the time, and I was quite young at the time, right, Morad? I was quite young at the time. I had less gray hair, and the community was very welcoming, and I was just 3 weeks after I published my sefer called Magen Avot on Moroccan halachot. Now it's already 3 volumes, but then it was my first volume, and it was 3 weeks after, and I was heavily involved in the research of minhagim in general. And when I talk about minhagim, there's Ashkenaz minhagim, there's Moroccan minhagim, there's Tunisian minhagim, and I was very curious to see also what the Sephardic community in Los Angeles, what did they follow, and I was Baruch Hashem, we had a Sephardic Bet Knesset there. We have some of the members that are here, and they were very wonderful, generous, welcoming people. But I didn't hear minhag like this is our minhag, that's our minhag. I never understood why they're not telling me what their minhag is. But I saw different things that they did that I definitely recognized that this is consistent with other minhagim of Klal Yisrael. And I always wondered, so what was the masoret? So they said we didn't have so many rabbis, whatever else. So Sharam Zamanzadeh, which is who's here with us today, once gave me a manuscript of his grandfather, Chacham David Sasson Rabban, from the Av Bedin of Hamedan, who later on moved to Tehran and passed away in 1974. and he gave me the manuscript, and I saw whatever psakim of the Beit Din that there was then. I gave it over to one of the avrechim at the time, Rabbi Ovadia, Rabbi Yehuda Ariel Ovadia, who is now in Lakewood, New Jersey, and he wrote the whole thing up. He typed it up, but I kept it in my inbox. We never really went further than that. Fast forward, in the meantime, I went to Toronto for 5 years. I came back. Lynn Colel moved to Pico Robertson. I was living in Pico Robertson at the time, and by that time, I published a few manuscripts of Chachmei Morocco. That's what I have, a publishing house called Machon Magen Avot Publishing House, which focuses on Moroccan Minhagim and Halachot and publishing manuscripts from Moroccan Chachamim. But I told myself that I meet a lot of times Persian yeshiva Bachrim over here in Los Angeles, and many of them, they don't have a sense of connection, pride, roots that they feel to the minhagim. And I told myself it's something that shouldn't be. A lot of them think that if you don't research something, if you don't know something, especially if you weren't born or saw anything, so you think that it was devoid of anything. And like Rabbi Davidi said on Sunday night, is that people told him in yeshiva, why should you follow any of your Sephardic or Persian traditions? There was nothing there. You have to become Ashkenazi. So that's what, and that's totally against halacha, as we're going to see, and it's something that's very inappropriate, because a person has to follow the traditions of his parents, and it's just a lack of knowledge to know what there was. And like Avishai pointed out, there was a difference in levels and in Torah. The Torah center at the time in that region was definitely Iraq, and the Chachamim of Persia went to study in Iraq. But there was a system, a very meticulous system of Batei Dinim in every city that there was in Iran. And you're going to see from the Sefer, there was communication between all these Batei Dinim. There was a clear Ofen Hapsak, and there was a level of Torah and Psak Halacha that was studied and that was given over from tradition. And to come and say that nothing ever, that things didn't exist, is a gross misunderstanding. It's mutzila azal rishonim, and it's coming to question things like the validity of certain very important halachic topics in Even HaEzer and in other areas, and that's v'chen lo ya'aseh. It's forbidden to be said. So the purpose of this sefer is really to strengthen and to document the strength that there was a system of Batei Dinim and Rabbanim throughout the generations. As Avishai mentioned, it's the longest existing community ever since Beit Rishon. There was somebody recently said in Teiman I'll point you out. There's a podcast that came out called Jewish History Soundbites by Yehuda Geber, that the first one we sponsored about the history of the Jews in Iran. I just saw yesterday came out the second part about from World War II till now, with the revolution, about the history of Torah that there was. So you could refer to that. Now, I want to get back to the topic of minhagim and customs. So based on this, the Torah of minhagim is the following, is that if there's a community that follows one of the opinions in halacha and of minhagim, there is an obligation, especially if it's an obligation as a chumrah, as protecting a certain halachot, that you have to follow according to halacha. If your custom is not to eat kitniot, for example, which I know the custom is to eat kitniot. If a Persian wouldn't have rice on Pesach, that would be already pikuach nefesh. I'm not saying, but if your custom is not to eat kitniot, you're not allowed. It's not that you have a choice to follow your custom or not. The Shulchan Aruch in Yoredea Siman Resh Yud Dalet says that you're obligated as a siyag, as a fence, to keep up that communal tradition. So I asked two Talmidei Chachamim that one of them used to actually pray with us once in a while in Westwood. His name is Avram Yitzchakian, Rabbi Avram Yitzchakian, originally from Los Angeles, and he lives in Sanhedrin or Chevet in Yerushalayim, together with his brother-in-law of Yosef Balanes, to put together and research the customs that there were in Iran, and we printed their kuntras called Or Paras. So they did the research. They discussed. You'll see in the Hagdama, they discussed with a lot of their people from the different cities, for the people from Shiraz and from Hamedan and from Esfahan and from Yazd and from other areas, that what were the original customs. And you'll see that there's a consistency among the cities in certain minhagim, whatever. And they didn't write so many of them. They wrote those that they felt halachically validated that this is called a custom, and it should be a custom that according to halacha should be continued, unless maybe you have extenuous circumstances and you ask a she'ela to your Rav. But one thing is for sure, if you'll see the Teshuvot of Chacham David Sasson Rabban, he quotes consistently, we followed Maran HaShulchan Aruch. Consistent with all Sfaradim and Ditut HaMizrach, Maran HaShulchan Aruch was the deciding factor. It was Kiblu Dat Maran. That's for sure. There's also another Teshuvah from Rav Elazar Chaim Hamedani. He was a Moreh Tzedek in Tehran in the year Tafresh Chav Gimel, which is around 150 years ago, and is brought down in the Shelot Tshuvot Chaim Veshalom Chelek Bet Siman Kuf Yud and Shelot Tshuvot Nedive Lev Even Ezer Siman Chav Gimel. You can take a look at the Marim Mekomot that there are in the book, and there also it's written that whether leachmir or leakel we accepted dat maran, except in areas of Gitin and Kiddushim, that there are questions, chas v'shalom, that a child can become a mamzer. Then we followed more stringent opinions, and this is consistent with most Edot Sfaradim in Detum Mizrach that were more machmir in this area. And it's klalim that you could see from the Chachmei Iran that they wrote already. So with that being said, there weren't Sfarim that documented the actual minhagim of Paras. There wasn't. And in my books in Magen Avot, I never write a minhag without documented exactly the source of which sefer it came from. We didn't have the luxury of doing that over here because there wasn't Sfarim. But there's many testimonies that this was done in Iran, and I'm going to give you a few cases, a few areas in halacha where you'll see how this point could come into play. I'll mention first with Rabbi Levi Chaim what he started with his, which was Hadlakat Nerot Shabbat. Now, Hadlakat Nerot Shabbat is a little bit of a controversial one because Rav Ovadia Yosef made a campaign to change the minhag of the Sfaradim and Ashkenazim that there was throughout the generation. And he writes in Yebi Omer as being the Gadol Ador, which he was, the tremendous leader of the Sephardic Jewry. He felt that he had a right to change the minhag. And those who follow Rav Ovadia Yosef left and right, that's a that they follow him consistently. I'm not saying you could pick and choose. They follow him. That means they take his chumrot as well. So I'm talking those. That's one thing. But if a person wants to know what the minhag was, and I'll be very clear about this, and you'll see also in the Haskama that Rav Yaakov Chaim Sofer from Yerushalayim, the grandson of Kaf Chaim, wrote in his Haskama, the universal minhag of communities across the board was that women light and then they make the bracha. And let me explain. Bracha always should be said over la'asiyatan before you do the hadlaka. There are exceptions, like netilat yadayim, we do the bracha afterwards. There are exceptions. When do the exceptions take place? When you have a reason why there's a problem of making a bracha beforehand. There's opinion in the Rishonim of the Bahag, the Bali Ilchot Gedolot, that says that if a person is Mikabel Shabbat, so he can't light anymore, you're Mikabel Shabbat, how could you light? So therefore, because of that Bahag, the Darkei Moshe, the Rama wrote that, from the Maril, that the custom was the woman lights first, then she makes a bracha, and then she hides her eyes. That way she fulfills over liyasiyatan in some type of degree. And this minhag wasn't only the minhag of the Rama, of the Rama, but I'm going to mention that this minhag was also adopted in the following countries, Sephardic countries: Algeria, Amsterdam, Afghanistan, Baghdad, Bukhara, Gibraltar, Jerba, Georgia, Damascus, India, Turkey, Kurdistan, Libya, Morocco, Egypt, the Portuguese community, the Persian community, Tunisian community. They all had this custom as well. of, this is Rav Yaakov Chaim Sofer quoting this, that and this is research that was done, that I myself spoke to many elders from Syria, from Iran, from Iraq, from different places, that first the bracha was, that first the woman lit hadlakat nerot and then she made a bracha. And the reason is simple, because when a person is going to say a bracha and then he's going to light, what is he saying? Le'adlik ner Shabbat, the woman, I'm sorry, she's mikabel Shabbat with her bracha, and then she's going to light. It's like a bracha levatala. This is the Aruch HaShulchan says. If she makes a bracha and then lights, she's making a joke out of the bracha. And because of that opinion, they were worried that chas v'shalom, you're mikabel Shabbat and then you light. The minhag, the universal minhag, was to light and then to make the bracha. This was, and this is, you should know, this custom, recently we have found that this custom is recorded in mamash early Rishonim. I'll mention that the Sefer HaNiyar from the Baalei HaTosfot, Hilchot Hadlaka Ve'Hatmana, writes B'Shem Rabbeinu Yitzchak, Hanashim Shelanu Nagot Shelo Levarech Al Ner Shabbat Ad Achar Shidliku, until they lit, then they make the bracha. Rav Shrira and Rav Hai Gaon, that were in that area of Iraq and Iran, right as well in Tshuvat HaGeonim Siman Pei Bet, Minhaga Dehai Mita, that they light and then they make a bracha. Rav Ovadia Yosef bases himself on a Rambam and other Rishonim to make a bracha and to light, which there are Rishonim that way. Shulchan Aruch is not clear on this subject. Shulchan Aruch many times quotes the Rambam. Over here in Siman in Hilchot Hadlakat Nerot, he writes Keshiyadlik Yevarech, a very ambiguous lashon. Rav Ben Zion Abba Shaul says it's an ambiguous lashon, and he says it seems to be the Shulchan Aruch said you first light and then you make a bracha. There's other places that are not as clear as that. Rabbi Shalom Misas also wrote that the Shulchan Aruch is clearly saying to make a light and then make a bracha. To be worried for the Bahag Shita. Either way, it's a machloket how to learn up in the Shulchan Aruch. Maran Achida writes that when Maran Shulchan Aruch is not explicit, we don't follow dat Maran. Only if dat Maran is explicit. So over here, you can't point and say Maran is one way, despite the fact that wouldn't have made so much of a difference, because whenever there's a minhag, you follow the minhag, despite the fact what Maran writes. So over here as well, there seems to be a very solid minhag throughout the generations, throughout Klal Yisrael. You have to understand, Chachmei Paras were consistent in most of the minhagim with all of Klal Yisrael. So here, this is a minhag as well. So the Ben Ish Chai writes this, the Chida writes this, to do this way. So somebody who their mother taught them, this is how you'd light Hadlakat Nerot. Imagine you come along and you say, no, I don't do that. Recently, actually, I gave a shiur in Har Nof on this topic to a yeshiva ktana, and they asked me about this subject, so I presented this subject. And afterwards, one of the Rabbanim, his name was Rav Atiyah, says that he was learning in the Yeshivat Porat Yosef when he was young, and he heard a shiur from Maran Rav Ovadia Yosef, Zchuto Yagen Aleinu Amen, that he said that you should make the bracha, because he was very forceful to change the minhag. So he goes to his mother and he says, Mom, you got it all wrong. You're making the hadlaka. And then he's telling her mother, and she was actually his father was a rav in the yeshiva in Porat Yosef. So he said, well, you're just getting it all wrong. So the father, heard this, and he was a Talmid Chacham. He knew that there's two sides to the coin. It's Machloket, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch. He says, come. They go to Rav Ezra Atiyah, the Rosh Yeshiva, who was still alive. And Rav Ezra Atiyah told him, he says, I know that you heard this opinion from Rav Ovadia Yosef, but we know what we're doing. We had Rabbanim and we have a Masorah, and listen to your mother. Just continue on doing what she was doing. Don't get so emotional. Now, if a person studies through the sugya and he follows that opinion, Rav Ovadia Yosef says that don't go like that minhag, go like another minhag. I fully respect that. I understand that, but I am not for people changing history and saying there was no such minhag. There was clearly, this was the accepted psak halacha for generations, and this is what how the Ben Ish Chai and others record it. So it's a topic to be taken b'koved rosh. If somebody says, I want to follow what my mother did, that is the status quo opinion. You want to change it, that's something else. But that's the status quo opinion. So that's about the bracha v'adlakat nerot Shabbat. I want to continue. When I wrote this sefer, I have a very good friend of mine who lives in Panama. His name is Rav Yosef Peretz. and he is a grandson of Chacham Elazar ben David, who was one of the leaders of the Persian Chachamim that did a lot of good, have built a lot of mosdot worldwide, as well as Los Angeles, that you are all familiar with. And he wrote that he was very happy. He's Moroccan, Rav Yosef Peretz. He deals with publishing Moroccan Sfarim like I do, but his mother is a daughter of Rav ben David. And he said that he was so happy to see the Sefer printed on Hamadan. I was able to get him a Sefer to Panama, and he was so happy to see it. He says that actually my grandfather remembered seeing a picture from his grandfather, Rav Pinchas Sahini. I don't know the name. And he saw in his picture, he grew peot. He had long peots. He says, therefore, I grew my peot as well. I started growing peot because of that tradition. And indeed, if you'll see one of the stories that Avishai brings in the Sefer is that one of the pogroms is that they wanted to cut off the peot of one of the Chachamim. So you see that there was and he got that from the book. He saw that. He was very happy to see that in the book there was that documented that they grew peot. So I don't have peot, and neither everybody else does. But you should know that they used to have peot in the older countries. So you can't say, oh, it's an Ashkenazi thing. It's not so simple. Now, let's move on to a different area of halacha. Pesach is coming up. Now, Pesach, their style of people, for some reason, is to try to be as lenient as possible and to find the most lenient Pesach lists that they can. That says basically, you could go into a store, look at the ingredients, you don't see that bread is written, so you buy it. This is a tremendous injustice to our forefathers and our grandmothers. Personally, if my grandmother, Aliyah Shalom, would see me doing that, she would take me and smack me in the corner 10 times. This is how you treat Pesach? And the Yirat Shamayim that we got from our forefathers to Pesach was chumrah, was cleaning the floors, was cleaning the walls, and taking processed foods where you have hundreds of ingredients, that some of the ingredients you won't even know. There was one case of Hellman's mayonnaise. Some Rabbanim said you're allowed to have it because they looked and the alcohol there is corn alcohol, until one of the experts of the OU, Rabbi Juravel, said, yes, I'm the one who's machshir Hellman's mayonnaise, and that corn alcohol is produced from water, that water is water that was soaked with grain inside, and that's how they produce it. So they said, no, but it's still nishtaneh or not nishtaneh. You can't know what's going on in food nowadays, and even if it's not written in the ingredients. And recently there was a letter that came out from Chacham Chachshwal from New York, and a few other Rabbanim signed on it, Chief Rabbi of Quebec and of Ontario and other places, that our tradition was never to buy processed things without a hechsher. Final. To go and start saying that based on these lenient opinions here and there is not our misorah, and it takes away from the we'll call it from the Chumran Pesach. There are certain items, if respected Rabbanim from Echsherim say this is okay, sugar is okay, and this is okay, that's one thing. But to go along and it's like a free-for-all is definitely not our tradition. Over here, if you could take a look in Or Paras, it's brought that the minhag was to be machmir even on glass. On kli zchuchit was to be machmir on glass. Our minhag is actually not that way. The Moroccan minhag is not that way, but if you take a look, there was Sfaradim like the Knesset HaGedolah, the Zichor LeAvraham, El Kalai, the Bulgarian minhag, the Kaf HaChaim, the Shulchan Gavoa. They all write that this was the minhag of being machmir, even using glass kelim on Pesach, which is interesting, which is definitely a change in a chumrah. And you have to ask your Rav, can you be lenient nowadays? Because we're going to see that there is going to be minhagim that you have to know how they apply nowadays. Let me give you another example. When I was in Westwood, one of the most common questions that I got, I wasn't asked all the time about the complicated halachot of borer on Shabbat or on others, was whether you're allowed to buy a stereo system during the Omer. Are you allowed to buy a new stereo system during the Omer? That was the most, they had stereo systems at the time, yeah? Nowadays, it's whatever, MP3, woofer, Beats, or whatever else. You're allowed to buy that during the Omer. I was like, what's the problem? I looked in the Shulchan Aruch. Where's the problem of buying kelim like that in the Omer? But they were very careful. Clothing. Rabbi, can I buy this clothing in the Omer or not? And the truth is, Maran Shulchan Aruch writes that you're not allowed to have weddings, and you're not allowed to cut your hair during the Omer. That's it. And there are many poskim that say that you're allowed to buy clothing during the Omer. Nevertheless, the Persian minhag is clear. They would not buy new things during the Omer. So you'd say, okay, so maybe it was just superstition. So number one is like this. Anything that has to do with superstition, there's a lot of superstitious minhagim, we try to weed that out. Because that's coming a lot of times from the Muslims. It's coming a lot of times from gypsies. It's coming a lot of times from other sources. And like the Sefer Nahar Mitzrayim writes, is that it's embarrassing for an intellectual nation like us, which is Lo nachash beYaakov Lo kisem beYisrael, that we should start adopting all of these funny customs, like putting blood on our new Mercedes whenever we. But those are not things that kapparot and all of that. There could be a source, kapparot, there could be a small source. I don't want to discuss kapparot right now, but there's things that are very close to kapparot, and that whole subject, you have to know whether that has halachic sources or not, and you have to know which are minhagei halacha, and which are minhagim of superstition that might be allowed to do, but not necessarily. Don't bring that into halacha. And when you do that, you cheapen all the whole halachic system, because halacha is basis of education and learning. And when you start mixing up all type of things of superstition, people that are secular, they just lump everything together, and that's a very dangerous thing. So let's keep it to halacha. Minhagei halacha, buying things during the Omer. There are sources from the Ikrei Adat, which is printed in the Shulchan Aruch, that in Italy they would be machmir. I'm sorry, I'm not reading the right thing. That they would be machmir. Not from the Ikrei Adat, from already the Tshuvat HaGeonim. So you can say, where does this Persian minhag come from? Who says it didn't come from the earliest sources of the area of the region of Paras? Rav Shmiri Gaon in Tshuvot Chachmei Ashkenaz v'Tzarfat Siman Samechet Gazru Chachamim shelo lasot simcha v'shelo lasot ksut chadasha, and not to make a new clothing until Shavuot. So here's an early source from the Geonim. And it's very possible that's where Chachmei Paras got it from generation after generation. You see that they were machmir not to buy new clothing. It didn't come just like that. It wasn't invented, and it wasn't something that just, there was no Torah or whatever else. There were things that came down in tradition. I think that's an excellent example. And this is brought down in the Sefer Leket Yosher, which was a student of the Trumat Hadeshen, writes this as well. The Yosef Ometz Yuspa. This was the minhag in Vermaisia. This is the minhag in Jerba. This was the minhag in places in Italy. So there's in some places in Morocco held this as well. So I'm saying there's a lot of sources of different minhagim. Yes. So he writes until Shavuot. It seems to be the minhag was at least until Lag BaOmer. So you'll read the Sefer if you want to see the different opinions on that. But this was documented that there's early sources to this minhag of not buying new clothing. It extended to other things as well, and that you'll have to ask the Rabbanim, where does that extend to, and in what circumstance you'd be able to buy. But at least you should know that it's not a custom just like, it doesn't matter. Lo yiv'ad berishonim. A person should never deny what his parents did and say, okay, it means nothing. If they're doing something, sometimes it could be, if a person if a person's doing a certain minhag that, like sometimes there's a person walked into a Bet Knesset and he saw everybody turning around during Berich Shemeh. They turned the opposite direction. He says, why are they turning around? So he went to the elders of the city. He says, I remember this minhag. It's because the poster of Berich Shemeh was in the back of the synagogue. So you have to do research, but you can't just throw the baby with the bathwater. You have to make sure that what's a minhag and what's not. And that's the purpose of this kuntras over here, to show what's a proper minhag, what's not a proper minhag. Getting married during the 3 weeks. I remember I was in the office at Rabbi Shalom Besas, Chief Rabbi Yerushalayim, before and Chief Rabbi Morocco at the time, and somebody asked him this question. He says somebody who's concerned about it definitely should not. You're right, according to halacha, according to Shulchan Aruch, strict halacha, one would be allowed. But the custom, not only in Paras, but the custom was in Turkey, in Bavel. Sounds familiar, right? Bavel. Jerba, Syria, Taiman, Libya. The Sefer Ma'im Chaim Rabbi Yosef Misas Chelik Bet Siman Kuf Lamed Bet writes this was the minhag in the universal. This was the universal minhag by Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. This was the minhag. Somebody wants to be lenient against the minhag, so he asks his Rav if he can be lenient against the minhag. But this was the Masoret HaPsak for generations. Getting to the 9 days, and here it's not going to be so popular. Nowadays as well, Sfaradim, oh, we do nothing. We do nothing. The Ashkenazim, yeah, they all smell, but us, we're nothing. We do no minagim whatsoever. No Shavua Shechalbo this year. I can do whatever I want. And because a person has that attitude, does whatever I want, he hardly knows what a churban is. In Are Paras, the minhag in Paras was to be extremely meticulous and careful about the minhagim of Churban Bet HaMikdash, and to remember what it means to do avilut for Churban Bet HaMikdash. So they didn't wash during the 9 days, and they didn't wash their clothing during the 9 days. They were machmir on kibbutz. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because according to strict halacha in the Shulchan Aruch, one is allowed. So here you'll see that the poskim of nowadays recognize that people are much more bothered by not taking showers and not having laundered clothing. It's much harder for them. So they find within the rubric of being machmir, that cold water might be allowed as long as it's not a hot shower. Not just letting everything go and say, well, disregard it. Have in mind that there is a derech a masoret psak and how to work with it. To find that nowadays, to try to see how, especially in Lichot Nida, they were very machmir, and it's very difficult to be machmir nowadays. So you find within the rubric of halacha how to be lenient. I want to point out to you that one of the Talmidei Chachamim that learns in our Bet Midrash, Rav Shlomo Yisraeli, he's been working for many years on this topic of minhagei paras, and I gave him a deadline. Rav Shlomo, you have to put out the sefer soon. That's it. The Torah, we already started the revolution of the Hachamim of Iran, and people have to know more about the minhagim. This is a small kuntras, and there's a lot more, but it has to be done with sources and knowing what's allowed and what's not allowed. Talit and tefillin Tisha B'Av that the Rosh Kollel Rabbi Levi Chaim mentioned. Wearing tefillin on Tisha B'Av in the morning, if you're not in Bet El, in Yerushalayim, if you're not part of the Yeshivat Bet El in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael, that changed the custom against the Shulchan Aruch not to wear tefillin, starting to, where does this come from? How could a person do this? So when we said this on Sunday, somebody said Rabbi Balanes in New York, they wear tefillin in the morning. And we researched it a little bit more. Says yes, because there are people who are not going to come at all to Bet Knesset. He was afraid they wouldn't wear tefillin all day. That's why he had a special. When you look deeper into the matter, you'll see just changing a minhag like that. I mean, I am to the extreme. I used to pray with Rabbi Shalom Besas in Yerushalayim Tisha B'Av, and he told anybody who comes with tefillin in the morning, please don't come to Bet Knesset. Because that was in Yerushalayim also not to wear tefillin. So I'm in Yerushalayim, I know there are those people who wear tefillin, but not in Yerushalayim to wear tefillin on Tisha B'Av morning. And like Rabbi Levi Chaim said, you have a son doing one thing and a father doing another thing. And Ke'ilu, the son knows more than the father. And when you look more in the sources, the Shulchan Aruch is the one who writes not to wear tefillin. It was a very, very prominent book. It's called the Shulchan Aruch, a bestseller. The Shulchan Aruch, bestseller. And he says not to write. And so there's a disconnect over here. It's a matter of education and knowing. This was the minhag not only in Paras, but in most countries. Once again, Bavel, like the Ben Ish Chai writes, Mitzrayim, Aram Tzova, Kushta. And also the Ben Ish Chai, he wanted to be machmir in this inyan, like the Mikubalim. He doesn't write to wear the tefillin in Bet Knesset. He says to wear it at home, and then you come to shul. But to change the whole thing around and start wearing tefillin in public, I don't know, that's a big question. Nachem on Tisha B'Av. This is something that the universal custom by the Edot HaSfaradim was to say Nachem, like the Ramai, was an old custom. The Shulchan Aruch likes to write all three tefillot, but here there was a minhag kadum before the Shulchan Aruch. Once again, in Baghdad, like the Gedulat Elisha and the Ben Ish Chai write. Consistent, once again. See, Hachmei Paras, the Minhagim Paras were very similar to Baghdad. Kaf HaChaim writes this in one place, that Rov Minhagei Paras Nigranim Acharei Bavel. So you have the Minhagin Kushta in Izmir, in Baghdad, Saloniki, Morocco, Jerba, Tunisia, always to write Nachem, always to say Nachem in the afternoon. I'm going to say one or two more. One of them is about Parashat Zachor is coming up. Parashat Zachor, the women, there was no minhag that the women come to Bet Knesset to hear Zachor. There was never such a custom that they have to. Sometimes a woman is with a bunch of kids and she has to drive herself crazy to hear Zachor, and sometimes it becomes a fashion show and whatever else. There was never such a. She wants to come in here to be yotzei some of the shitot she's chayav. Baruch haba. But don't start marketing it as a halacha li Moshe Sinai. And when a posek like Rabbi Levi Chaim knows that the minhag is not that way, and then if you want to be machmir, so when a lady comes to him and asks him, Rav, I'm gonna, it's gonna cause a tremendous amount of shalom bayit if I have to come to Bet Knesset, if I have to. So he'll know that was the minhag not to come. You have what to rely on. You don't have to be machmir, but you have to know what the original minhag was. You want to be machmir, baruch haba, but don't start saying that it's a minhag. There are many more minhagim like basar and chalav, how long we waited after milk, having meat, and different areas of ilchot nida, and calling the child after somebody who's alive or not. So all of these are discussed over here, and it's tremendous addition, especially if you read the beginning of the book, which is about all the psakim that you saw in Hamidan, and all the psakim that you saw in that there was batedinim. Mostly it's about laws of marriage and laws of gitin, because that's what came to Bet Din. And you also come to see the kuntras or paras, how consistent minagim of paras was with Bavel. You get a whole different perspective of things, and you can't just wipe away history and say it wasn't important, it wasn't chashuv. And I'm coming as a perspective of somebody who studied minhagim of other edot, like Morocco and like Tunisia, because in my work I had to study also the minhagim of Tunisia and Babylonia and Egypt and Ashkenaz, and I saw a similarity with all of them, because it was traditions that were from the beginning, and that's how we were posek. Like Marana Bet Yosef writes, you follow psak halacha. Like Rav Ovadia Yosef says, you follow minagim. Like Rav Ovadia Yosef says, like Rabbi Levi Chaim quote, you follow minagim where you know. I have a Rav that I know in Chicago, a big talmid of Rav Ovadia Yosef, that he said that he's from Tunisian descent. He follows all his minagim Tunisia. When he doesn't know, he follows his Rav Ovadia Yosef. Otherwise, his status quo, like Rabbi Levi Chaim said, you follow your minagim. So this is a little bit of an overview on the minagim and minagi paras, and you can see a little bit more of a history, and Chazaku Baruch on Sharam Zaman Zideh for really pushing this, and Avishai Shraga also for pushing this, and all the people that were involved, that we were able to get this sefer. And B'ezrat Hashem, it should start a revolution now, that we should have many more sfarim and manuscripts. Like somebody came up to me and says, Rabbi, why aren't you printing a manuscript from Shiraz? So I told him, you know why? Because you didn't give me a manuscript. Give me a manuscript and we'll print it, Be'ezrat Hashem. So anybody who has manuscripts, whatever else, let us know. It would be a wonderful thing of the documentation. Now that we have printing presses and ways how to do it, it should be mifursam and known. Chazaku Baruch.